So Bertrand Russell can't argue from some sort of abstract, theory-neutral, no worldview perspective. He answers these questions too, and the way that he answers these questions interacts with the way, conditions the way that he views the world. And that way, when he makes an argument, for example, his argument in Why I'm Not a Christian, against Christianity, we need to know that he's not just arguing against Christianity, he's arguing for a very specific position and from a very specific position. For example, we need to know, it's kind of intuitive, but it's important to establish, and has a lot of consequences, that you can't argue against something without simultaneously arguing for something in terms of a standard or a replacement or something. For example, if you were to make the claim that we should go to BC's Grill on Franklin Street, and I said no, and I were to make an argument against BC's, the argument couldn't just be flatly against eating BC's. It would have to be an argument privileging something else, for example, Panera, or anything else edible on Franklin Street. You guys thought I'd be hitting on atheism. Really, it's just a rail on BC's. Don't like it. It's disgusting, Steve. For example, even people who say that they do not endorse either of the presidential candidates always have some sort of phantom concept in their mind of what the ideal candidate would look like that they're arguing for. Usually it's themselves, which is fine, So this leads me to my first major point, that everything we read in Bertrand Russell, we can't just read as being against Christianity. We have to read it as coming from a specific humanist perspective and addressing Christianity from that perspective. And this way, since it's coming from a position, talking to a position, the best way we can talk about it is in terms of dyadic, meaning between two things that do this, dialogue. And this again seems pretty intuitive, but it has a lot of extreme ramifications that we need to talk about. So I'm reading Bertrand Russell, and I'm not reading it just as something that's talking about Christianity. I have to read it as something from a humanist perspective, from specifically Bertrand Russell's perspective, talking to specifically my Christian perspective. And here are some of the ramifications of that. One is that we cannot immediately throw the burden of proof on one side. Bertrand Russell tends to be arguing from some sort of neutral position and immediately puts the burden of proof on his opponent, which would be Christians. Now, this is not necessarily the fact. I think a lot of Christians would mistakenly agree with him, but actually his humanism is just as much a worldview, if not just as much a religion, and it therefore is just as much in need of positive arguments for it as Christianity. So I'm not saying that he's necessarily wrong, because in the context of the debate, he can put the Bertrand Russell, the burden of proof on the person, but in terms of just looking at it from a different perspective, you have to see the burden of proof is on everyone to answer these unavoidable questions. I mean, that's the thing, they're unavoidable. So at the same time, Bertrand Russell can't just say, Christianity's answers to these unavoidable questions are wrong. He has to simultaneously say, and these answers are better. It's inevitable. Second point is that we need to make sure that the relevance of each point brought up is relevant to something that people actually believe. And that if this is Bertrand Russell's humanism, engaging in dialogue when I read it with my Christianity, then anything else that has no bearing on those can be thoroughly dismissed, or at least temporarily dismissed for the sake of the discussion. For example, if Bertrand Russell is attacking beliefs that I don't hold, then I'm not compelled to examine them or really engage with them because it's irrelevant to what we're talking about at the time. Some of the ones that he uses in Why I'm Not a Christian include his condemnation of witch burning, with which I staunchly agree. Russell Johnson, no wait. Religious torture, legalism, and the idea that the unaided reason can establish the existence of Christian God. I don't agree on any of those things. So Bertrand Russell attacking them is something that I would, I guess, laud him for. Get some more. This is the awkward part. And I think a lot of times this point is blurred because people, when they see it as Bertrand Russell representing atheism writ large or representing humanism writ large, have to see themselves, especially if they're a Christian, seeing the other side as Christianity writ large instead of individual worldviews colliding. I think this happens a lot, that people get into sort of an us versus them mentality that causes confusion and leads people to argue in circles and to argue improperly. I think one example on campus is that a lot of Christian students take Bart Ehrman's class or read Misquoting Jesus, and feel the need to, they get on the defensive about it. When in actuality, what I would say is that the position he's attacking is a position on biblical inspiration that they don't actually hold. So it's a whole lot of argument over very little. Similarly, I'm sure all of you remember the scandal about His Dark Materials book that came out. His Dark Materials books, great books. Pulitzer fighting, it's great. That came out a few years ago. And I think a lot of Christians got up in arms because it was attacking religion. Well, if the religion that's attacking doesn't resemble the Christianity that you hold, then there's no real argument there. I mean, it's something you can agree with, and it's not really relevant to the interfaith dialogue. So, to the extent that what Bertrand Russell is attacking, when he attacks stuff like witch burning against it, is attacking he's either ignorant of the positions of Christians as they actually stand, or he's building straw men, which is a logical term based on an ancient Irish practice. Some of the straw men he puts in are he attacks the arguments that rabbits have white tails so that they're easier to hunt. That's not a good argument. I'm sorry. It's not a good argument. He also, I know you put a lot of stock in it, but I really, his argument against the injustices committed in the name of religion, again, witch burning. So the important thing that we can draw from this conclusion is that you really need to know, when you enter into any sort of interfaith dialogue, you need to be very cognizant of what you actually believe and what the other person in the dialogue actually believes. And that way it'll be a lot more vibrant, and people won't get on the defensive about things they shouldn't be on the defensive about, so on and so forth. And the third and most important thing that we can extrapolate from our engagement with Bertrand Russell is that you cannot treat a worldview piecemeal. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't allow itself to do that. Context is extremely important to understanding the way a worldview works. Bertrand Russell's system of argumentation separates, if you've read it, he separates it into, I think, 15 different sections, and then argues against each of those individually with the whole weight of his humanist perspective. And, for example, in the moral problem, he attacks the doctrine of hell, completely isolated from biblical doctrines of justice, teleology, redemption, and free will. The only problem is that Christianity doesn't have a doctrine of hell that's completely isolated from the Christian doctrines of justice, teleology, free will, and redemption. So he's arguing sort of against something that doesn't actually exist because he's taking it out of context, when in actuality Christians would have to believe it in context. The best analogy I can think of is if we were trying to decide who was the better football team, the New England Patriots or the Carolina Panthers. And the way we went about doing this is saying that, well, all the Patriots squad put together, all 11 men, could easily beat just Steve Smith. And they could certainly beat just Jake Delhomme. And they could definitely beat just D'Angelo Williams standing all alone. I mean, picture 11 Patriots players playing against D'Angelo Williams. He'd put up a fight. He'd probably get at least a field goal. But they would win. Would you consider that, if they did that to every single member of the Panthers team one at a time, would you consider that a fair game between the Patriots and the Panthers? Would you say that that was actually the Panthers, as anyone understands them, who were playing against the Patriots? I don't think so. Similarly, when Bertrand Russell isolates all the different doctrines of Christianity and treats them piecemeal and doesn't read them in the context of the other beliefs that support them and make sense of them, that's exactly what he's doing. Each of those players has merit in the context of the team that they're playing with. Similarly, each doctrine within any worldview, not just Christianity, also Bertrand Russell's humanism, has credibility in part through its connection to other beliefs. And I think this discussion of context is extremely important because it needs to be taken further. I think this is very popular in a lot of different texts on religion. It's extremely important. So, for example, some of the most important aspects of people's worldviews are their religion, and then soon coming after that is politics. The thought is that you're not supposed to talk about religion and politics. That's what they always teach you. Ironically, I'm majoring in communication studies, religious studies, and poli-sci, so I'm majoring in talking about what you're not supposed to talk about, which is a little subversive of me. So Bertrand Russell attacks the doctrine of hell without considering how hell fits into the grand scheme. Really what he's doing is he's just not giving it enough time. Like, we can talk about politics and religion, but what's dangerous is when you talk about them without seeking understanding, without putting in the requisite amount of time and effort to really understand where we're coming from and where the other person is coming from. And I think that's something that we really need to realize, especially in election season with politics and so on and so forth, that if we don't want to talk past each other, talking past each other comes from not really understanding one another's worldviews, not really understanding the principles by which other people base all of their argumentation. So we really need to get at understanding where the other person's coming from if we're going to address them at all, or else we're just shouting across chasms like that movie. from Finland.